Hello, welcome to the Power Up Live stage presented by Wärtsilä. I am joined by a trio of great experts here to talk about the key to decarbonization, energy storage. And I am joined by three great panelists. Anne Hoskins is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Market Development for Generac Power Systems. Kavita Ravi is Senior Vice President of Operations for BlueWave Solar. And Joan White is my colleague at SEIA, Director of Storage and Interconnection Policy. So really looking forward to this discussion. Thanks for taking time today. Let's start with just setting the stage, letting folks know a little bit more about your organizations and what you do. Joan, can you start just about sharing a little bit more about SEIA and what you do with us?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joan White. I'm the Director of Storage and Interconnection Policy with SEIA, the Solar Energy Storage Industry Association. Oh, I added the word storage. We are the trade association that covers solar and storage for the U.S. And what that means is political advocacy, both in Congress, in state legislatures across the country, in public utility commissions. So we're really out there advancing solar and storage in dockets all across the U.S., driving the industry forward with the policies that we need. In my role specifically, I tend to advance the deployment of energy storage and also interconnection reform in state dockets and also through advocacy at the federal level as an expert witness and also in sort of working groups and policy design dockets. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I think what SEIA brings to the table is that national perspective on where we stand on storage today.
Kavita?
I am Kavita Ravi. I lead operations for BlueWave. BlueWave is a solar and storage developer originally out of Boston, and now we're in 12 to 15 states and are also interested in large-scale energy storage. Welcome to our panel. And I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Anne Hoskins. I lead the policy team at Generac. We are very excited to have a nice booth out here on the floor in the C area. And Generac, as you may know, is a leading producer, manufacturer of all sorts of resiliency and reliability products, from generators through batteries, through smart inverters, EV chargers, but the batteries are really what drew me to Generac 2 years ago. I'm a former regulator. I also led a policy team at another solar company, and it's just such an exciting time for battery technology. And I'm very excited to see, SEIA has got much more into batteries in the last couple of years, and Generac is excited to just be one of the leading providers of domestic batteries in the future.
Great. So, Joan, can you kick us off with just kind of a lay of the land of the solar and storage policy landscape?
Yeah, I'd love to. The future is bright for solar and storage in the U.S. And we've actually seen not only massive deployment in the last 3 to 4 years, but we're seeing year-over-year exponential growth. So in Q1 of 2024, the U.S. installed 993 megawatts of battery storage. That's an 84% increase of Q1 in 2023. So that means that each year we are growing exponentially. The majority of the deployment is in the utility scale sector. So about 88% or so of deployments are going to be that larger sector, the utility scale. You're talking 5 or more megawatts connecting to the transmission system. The remaining 12% is in C&I and residential spaces, so that's connecting to the distribution grid. And the value that storage is delivering is mostly related to forward capacity markets, ancillary services, energy arbitrage, and renewable integration. So we're seeing markets open up across the country and opportunities for storage to participate on an equal footing with other energy resources to provide these critical services to the grid. That being said, energy storage costs are coming down very dramatically. So over the next 5 years or so, we expect to see massive declines in costs, and that's installed costs. And that's due to the ramping up of production of lithium-ion batteries across the globe. We're seeing EV demand really drive up battery production, and grid batteries benefit from that because as you produce more, it gets cheaper to produce. So we expect costs to continue to decline. We also expect domestic manufacturing to become a major part of the sector. So there are just a couple of companies right now that are manufacturing packs, but we're hoping for end-to-end manufacturing like by 2028 or 2030. So the future is bright. The two biggest markets for the utility scale right now are California and Texas. And those value streams are mostly driven by the resource adequacy market in California. And in Texas, you're seeing massive revenues from ancillary services. In the residential market, we've got some new markets opening up next year, we're hoping. We had some major legislation pass in Maryland that set an energy storage procurement target. And we've got legislation that we're working on this fall in Illinois. So hopefully we'll see more of a residential markets open in those states. And of course, there's always the juggernaut of California with the SGIP program and New York with the VETO program. So storage in the past has been described as an emerging technology, but I'd say at the moment it's in like a mid-stage maturation. We are with storage now where we were with solar in 2014, 2015. We're at the bottom of the hockey stick and we're about to see that steep increase. So if your business has not added storage to part of what you're working on, you really need to get up to speed. And here's where I'm going to just take a brief safety moment, and I'm hoping my colleagues will indulge me. If you plan to get into the storage business and you're an installer or a developer or an EPC firm, please, please, please go get trained in the latest safety codes and standards related to storage. So for residential sector, that's NFPA 855. That'll tell you where you can install, what the protections need to be, how close to the furnace, how far from a window, what's the burn time between walls. Please install your systems in accordance with manufacturer's instructions and always in accordance with the codes and standards, specifically with NFPA 855. So that's my safety moment and my overview of the sector. I'll turn it back to you, Jacob. Thanks.
Amazing. So, Anne, can you talk to us a little bit more about just the importance of energy storage?
Yes, absolutely. So I look at storage as what I would call the game changer, particularly for the residential distributed energy sector. I worked in distributed solar for a number of years through all the solar wars. As people would say, we would hear from regulators and others that the sun doesn't shine at night, it's intermittent, you're not going to be able to count on this. Well, batteries change that, right? With batteries now, we are able to be that resiliency source of support for homeowners, for businesses, for community centers. And this is something that's really just changed over the last, I think, as Joan said, this has really been since 2015, 2016 that batteries started coming on, and now they're here. It's a technology that's available. And what we're able to do now that we can empower people to use batteries for their own resilience and reliability, but we also now know how to aggregate it. I know we're going to have a question on virtual power plants, which brings resilience and reliability not just to the individual homeowner or business, but to the grid at large, and particularly at the distribution level, which is an area that, I really want to talk about because there's been a lot of focus on industrial size batteries or utility scale batteries. But when you have batteries, and the new battery we have on the floor now is 18.5 kilowatt hours. These are big batteries. They can do a lot in people's homes, but also when you aggregate them, you can do a lot to relieve stress on the grid. We can also do it to relieve the need for peaker plants that are very inefficient and expensive. So we're really at an exciting point now, but I think it's important for all of the installers and people in the communities to become aware of the technology and to communicate the benefits of this with the policymakers and the regulators so that they recognize this is a real resource for reliability. Last thing I say is we are very excited at Generac that we were one of the awardees for a big Puerto Rico project funded by DOE, which is completely focused on reliability and resilience. In Puerto Rico, from 2017 with Hurricane Maria, 2021, I can't remember that hurricane name right now, but massive hurricanes that really impacted the livelihoods and lives of so many people in Puerto Rico. So the federal government, and through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, have put in a lot of resources. Hundreds of millions of dollars of resources with the idea of going home by home and empowering people to protect themselves and their families and their homes. And Generac's really proud to be one of the companies that's leading on that. But it's just an example of what we can do in communities all over the country that are facing these resiliency challenges.
Joan or Kavita, any thoughts on the importance of energy storage?
I started paying attention to energy storage before its moment in the sun, as Joan articulated. like in 2014, 2013. So it was almost not there. And even back then, it was called the Swiss Army knife, right? The big sort of savior, helping with intermittency of renewables. I think really that the importance of energy storage is not only that it can help with, the different markets and resiliency, but also with the intermittency of renewables, really drive up the scale of renewables that we can have by smoothing the intermittency. But then there's also the applications of asset deferral, right? Both on the distribution and transmission scale to help with just less wear and tear on the existing assets by using energy storage cleverly. The fact that it can both charge and discharge is a real advantage, and unlike any other asset that we have in the both distribution and transmission grid.
Yeah, and I'll maybe tack on a little bit to what Kavita and Ann spoke about, which is storage as an equity asset. We know that there are communities who were historically disadvantaged under the fossil fuel system. And I kind of think about that in three ways. One is the burdens of the fossil fuel system. Where does the pollution go? Where are projects sited? Two, the benefits that clean energy can offer. And then three, kind of procedural justice. Like, are those communities involved in the decision-making process? And energy storage is just an absolute game changer when it comes to grid equity. And the reason for that is we can take intermittent renewable resources, turn them into baseload power, so that you can get that power at peaking times or when the grid is stressed, and you don't necessarily have to be turning on those fossil units. That reduces pollution overall in historically disadvantaged communities. Secondly, energy storage is really important from an equity perspective because it can provide reliability and resilience to those who are most vulnerable during extreme climate events, during outages. So anytime we're active in state dockets, we're always trying to pull in that perspective and say, can we give an additional incentive, additional money on the table for folks with disabilities, the elderly, remote communities or indigenous communities that might not have grid access already, and really use and leverage the power of energy storage to right the wrongs of our historical energy system that's so disadvantaged redlined communities and low and moderate income communities. So yeah, an equity asset, it's a really important component whenever we're thinking about policy design for storage.
Great. And one thing you've all touched on a little bit is energy storage as a way to get us to meeting our clean energy goals. Can you speak a little bit about just why it's so essential in getting us to where we need to be?
I can touch on that. I mean, I think, as I said, there was a lot of development in solar. There still is. This has been a tremendously, particularly on the utility scale side, right? This last year has been, phenomenal in terms of growth. I think we're hoping for a lot more growth on the distributed side in the year ahead. But all along, you've had this concern about the disconnect in timing, right? Like, you're going to have solar at the wrong time. We don't have the transmission built that we really need to move the utility scale solar to the places where the people are. And what's so important, particularly in the distributed side, is you can put solar and battery systems on homes in a day. I mean, you can go, it may seem small, but you start getting thousands of these together, you can actually have a very big impact in bringing clean energy. And that's what the numbers are starting to show. I mean, SEIA has all the stats, but, that is the power of getting to actually do these things quickly, home by home, business by business. And I think that is how we're really going to be attacking this because, I am absolutely in favor of all efforts to try to bring clean energy, into the country. But there seemed to be a sense in the last few years that the answer had to be go big. We had to have the big developments and we had to have this huge amount of transmission. And we're seeing that we do need that, but it takes a lot of time. So what we can do with batteries is we can get these distributed resources and commercial and the ones out on the system, get them in place and really take advantage of the solar power we have and not have it, some of the frustrating things is that without storage, you end up in some places having negative pricing, having to let power go, hearing that people say it's not valuable to have it in the middle of the day. It's really valuable power. Store it in the middle of the day. Let's use batteries to use it at the expensive and challenging peak periods. Use it overnight, hold people through outages. I mean, it really is the game changer.
So I come from Massachusetts, and there's 4 to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind potential off the coast of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and the eastern seaboard there. And as Anne mentioned, there isn't enough transmission to bring it, and also, like, the wind blows at night, so to use it, right? And really, what we're seeing is proposals of energy storage on the coast, right, to sort of bank the power when it comes in. So certainly, like, it is going to be critical to our clean energy goals. I'll just cite one more example, and that is that when we go through the transition for electrification of vehicles, that's going to put in a kind of a pressure on the distribution and transmission system that is unprecedented. You know, you're going to have these charging and fast charging, so high spikes of power. All of that can be mitigated by energy storage there, both in terms of cost to reduce high demand charges and to reduce the stress on the grid itself.
Yeah, great. And maybe I'll just add a little bit to that, which is about the evolving nature of the grid. Look, if you were a grid planner back in the 80s or the 90s, you had like one problem to solve. You controlled your generation and your load went up and down. So you just dialed your generation up and down to match your load. The challenge now is that both sides of that equation are changing all the time. There are aspects of your generation fleet that you don't control. You can't control when the wind blows and when the sun shines. And there are aspects of your load side that you now can control through the power of VPPs, where you're aggregating electric vehicles or you're aggregating small home battery systems to control those sides. So I would say that when there's no such thing as a silver bullet for climate change, there's only silver buckshot. We have to have every solution on the table, and all of them have to be working together. So we need wind, solar, and batteries are that key technology. It's not going to be the same number of megawatts. Like when you look at the megawatts of solar deployed, it's absolutely massive. Our projections show that by 2030, we expect under a business as usual scenario that we're going to have about 450 gigawatts of energy, gigawatt hours of energy storage on the system. But we think we need around 700 or so to really provide those balancing services so that you give an asset, you give a tool to those grid operators to balance out energy and wind, solar and wind on the grid. So it's a critical grid resource to reach our clean energy goals.
Great. Yeah, and one thing you mentioned there is VPPs, and I know you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. As everyone knows, I mean, virtual power plants have become a hot topic. I think there's probably 3 or more sessions at this conference on virtual power plants. So what are virtual power plants? They really are not necessarily all that virtual. I mean, a home that has solar and batteries, a smart thermostat, that's a virtual power plant, right? That is something where people are producing their own power, they're using a battery to store it, and they could even go off grid for, if there's an emergency or otherwise. But what the power of virtual power plants is really is, okay, let's get that and multiply it by 1,000 customers or 5,000 customers. And then let's have the ability to, have either a utility or a third-party aggregator manage that so that if there is either a warning of a potential outage on either the bulk system or on the local distribution system, that aggregator can take little bits from every one of those storage units. They don't have to run it all down. They can take some. You can get the power of sharing, really, sharing the power that everybody doesn't need at all. They can give up some of it. And by that, we can avoid sometimes outages, which is the most important. But you can also avoid upgrades that might be necessary. Maybe you don't need to have that extra transformer put in place if we can actually utilize the excess power. There's also a really important equity and economic issue here. And that is, like, one of my former CEOs in my life used to refer to batteries when we started as, if you just have the customer use the battery, it's like keeping a thoroughbred horse in the barn. Because there's a lot of power and, in these batteries. Everybody, you can use them now to manage your rates, for, they call it arbitrage, or if you have a time of use rates. But you've got excess power, why not share it? And why not get paid for it? And that is really the big issue. It's something I'm giving a lot of thought to. I don't think that the value of this resource has been fully recognized. You know, we've had these debates in the past over how to value distributed resources and particularly rooftop solar. But when you have a battery with it, there is that resiliency and reliability value. There is the value that it can bring to avoiding T&D upgrades, of leveraging out voltage issues, and that has not been fully recognized. So if you could recognize that, and we could compensate people for sharing their battery power, then that's a nice economic incentive for them to go get those batteries. And it's also equitable. It makes it so they're more affordable for everybody to get this technology. And so I think that is one of the next frontiers of policy that we all need to work on, is to really make sure that the value of resiliency and reliability is reflected in what people are paid for participating in this.
Kavita, what states are doing well on energy storage?
So I'm not going to repeat what Joan said earlier, but I will talk about the experiences that she didn't touch on, and that is Massachusetts and Connecticut and fledgling efforts of New York, like you mentioned. So in Massachusetts and Connecticut, there's been a real recognition of this importance of storage that we've just been talking about. And they've tried to address two different aspects of being able to recognize or realize the economic potential of storage that Anne was just describing. And one of them is, what are the charging rates? So to oversimplify it, I'll say that if a storage is realizing revenue on the wholesale market, then there was a situation where there was a double payment of wholesale rates. And so that has been recognized, and now there's been some collaboration among all the different stakeholders, and utilities are going to file a rate with FERC, which is fair and equitable, and is going to be economically advantageous for storage, right? So the retail charging rate was actually killing the economic value of energy storage. And I don't mean like the home systems. I mean the front-of-the-meter systems that can be up to 5 megawatts, or the large systems. Those are typically not subject to retail rates. But those front-of-the-meter systems would benefit from that. Massachusetts and Connecticut are sort of in tandem there because they share some distribution utilities. The other thing that Joan and I have collaborated on is what we call the operating parameters tariff. So, these systems, the storage systems, they both charge from the grid and discharge into the grid. And this caused the distribution utilities to sort of choke up and say, oh, no can do. But we've been really collaborating with them in a productive way to arrive at some guardrails that the utilities want to impose on energy storage assets, while our own interest is to keep them economically viable, so that those guardrails don't inadvertently cut out any revenues that the assets can earn. So these are some efforts, and I think they're nation leading in that aspect, and we expect other states to take it on. It's a little different from the SGIP program in California, which is actually very generous, but is not sustainable in other states that don't have this, the amount of dollars that the incentives can put out as part of the California SGIP. I would say this is like a version 2 and much more thoughtful, and really does try to balance what the storage assets need versus, what the distribution grid operators need, et cetera.
Could you tell us a little bit more about California's model?
Yes, so in California, it's quite interesting. They have, California has a lot of agencies, but we know that the California Public Utilities Commission is the regulatory commission. They're the ones that oversee the SGIP program, which is more of a traditional, upfront incentive grant program. A couple of years ago, there was, it was really right around the same time as the IRA, California also wanted to see what they could do to shore up distributed resources. And so I think about $1 billion was initially allocated, sent over, authorized to the California Energy Commission. So it's a different group to really look at what kind of incentives and programs would be necessary to build out more distributed resources, and also for emergencies, because this was I live in California. This was at a time where we were having a lot of wildfires, we were having outages from that, and there were concerns about shortages and also about growth in demand and potential retirement of some centralized resources. So one of the programs, it took a while for a lot of stakeholders to work together, but I think DSGS is really interesting. There's like 4 different options, one of which, option 3, is for batteries in particular, and it does pay for, I think it gives an upfront incentive, and then it also has a payment for participating over a month, like 4-month period or so. And this year, it's turned out to be, as everybody knows, very hot the last few days. I think that the participants, the VPP participants, are being compensated very well. So we will see. I think it's a good model for other states to look at, and it really was a lot of stakeholder engagement in building that one.
Great. Joan, do you have any thoughts on what states are doing well or exciting things coming down the pike?
Yeah, I'd say one of the most kind of critical issues facing energy storage in 2025 is going to be interconnection. And there are a few states that are really leading on interconnection for storage. So I want to point to New Mexico, which is the only state that scored an A on IREC's interconnection report card. And for our international audience, the landscape of energy policy in the US is very driven by federalism. So if you're connecting to the distribution grid, that's going to be like a state level issue. So I would say on interconnection, you're going to look to states that model energy storage as it operates. So we've talked a lot about incentive programs, but almost just as important is what is the retail rate that the storage pays when it charges, and also what are the parameters under which it's modeled during interconnection. So in general, it's been worst case scenario, meaning they model it as though it's demanding electricity during those peak times. So that can cause grid upgrades. It can even prevent many projects from penciling out. They also occasionally will model it as a worst case scenario in the output phase, where you're putting power out onto the grid during a time when the grid's already congested with renewable power in that area. So what we really want to see is models emerging from utilities that can send dynamic signals through DERMS to storage resources and say, hey guys, the grid's peaking, how about you don't charge your asset right now? And that way we can avoid distribution grid upgrades. And FERC in FERC Order 2023 essentially laid out a similar kind of rubric for modeling storage and interconnection, saying you have to model the asset as it's going to operate, not under worst case scenarios. So I'd say the states that are doing it the best right now in terms of interconnection modeling are going to be New Mexico. I'm really looking to Massachusetts, hoping we get a positive ruling there, but we're seeing developments in Massachusetts. And then on the federal level, I'd say ISO New England right now is kind of the model for how RTOs can accurately model storage in interconnection. So we've made real progress on that front.
I could add one on that, and I have to give props to IREC as well, the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. And if you're out there, there's a number of IREC sessions. They're really leaders and essential players. I've been engaged with them for a number of years. But they were very involved in California and putting into place proposals that I think are called the limited generation profiles, which sounds very similar to what was proposed in Massachusetts. But it really is that idea of saying, okay, we know we have this power. As I mentioned, Generac's excited we're putting out, we think, the most powerful residential battery today. But it's exciting. There's a lot of power there. We want to put it in people's homes. What we don't want is when installers go to put that in people's homes that the local utility says, sorry, the transformer can't handle it. So there's an answer other than, yes or no. It's, okay, we're smart. We have controls. We can titrate, right? When how much power goes out and when it goes out. In our case, our generator is linked to our Ecobee thermostats, and there's other controllers here that we're seeing all over the floor. We're at a different time, and so it shouldn't just be, you've got something big, sorry, you can't do it, or you've got to pay X million dollars for upgrades. We really want to work with utilities. We want to make sure that we can use the technology, the data, to efficiently use these resources. And I think that my understanding anyway, is that limited generation profile approach was going in that direction.
Kavita, I know you wanted to talk about interconnection a little bit as well. Can you talk about that?
All right, this is my soapbox. Interconnection is the biggest problem facing our generation in terms of overcoming climate change and deploying renewable energy resources, but perhaps also like EVs will become a problem when they gain volume. So it is very important to modernize the grid, to make it digital, self-aware, controllable, and put our best efforts to it. And thus far, it has just really been the grid we've had for 50 years with small amounts of improvements around the edges. So for many years now, I have spent thinking and working with a variety of stakeholders on overcoming interconnection barriers. And that is very, very important. And there's no single state that is a leader. But with every state making a step forward, we can collate all the best pieces and collectively move forward. So I would say that's very important to pay attention to. And really the answer is a modern, self-aware, digital, and controllable grid.
What states have you seen doing the right things on interconnection?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Like I said earlier, I think New Mexico is kind of top of the list. They just sort of adopted wholesale the IREC model interconnection procedures that they put out in 2023. They're in kind of a technical interconnection requirements review period right now, where they're really laying out like, do you need DTT? Do you how do we get your fast track screening done? All that kind of stuff. So New Mexico's top of the pack. I also think California's got some pretty positive modeling in terms of interconnection. It gets more challenging when you get to the bigger size system. And here's where I think energy storage gets a little bit hung up. If you have a generation asset that's, say, solar, it's going to be putting power out during certain times of day. That's like fairly predictable. You're going to be modeled at your maximum power output under kind of grid conditions. Where it gets tricky with storage is you can charge and discharge. And so I think what I was describing earlier, where the grid is changing, that both sides of that equation, both the generation and the load, have elements that are controllable and elements that are not controllable. And the utilities have to get more sophisticated about how they operate both sides of that. So we need like AI tools to unlock the controllability on both sides. And then we also need our interconnection practices to reflect that flexibility. So in terms of who's on top of the pile for interconnection, I definitely would say those states that we kind of went over already. There are many states that don't have any state interconnection policies in place. So that's like large swaths of the Southeast, some parts of the Midwest. There's no state level interconnection. It's just the utility by utility. It really varies what the standards and rules that they apply. So I would urge public utility commissions to take a proactive stance on interconnection in regards to energy storage, ask for authority from legislatures to implement interconnection rules, and then use IREC's 2023 model interconnection procedures in those states. So SEIA is going to be working very hard on that issue in 2025. It's one of our top priorities in terms of both the distribution scale, which is kind of governed by the state, but then also the transmission scale. So we've got attorneys that are working at FERC on 2023 implementation to get storage accurately modeled in interconnection. So we don't see the very high upgrade costs that really are not necessary. Like, in fact, if you are operating in concert with the utility, if the utility has a good distributed energy resources management system, DERMS, you can not only avoid grid upgrades, you can actually alleviate congestion on the grid and defer the necessity for distribution grid upgrades. So what we're really looking to utilities to do is partner with us, tell us areas of your grid that are congested. We can put batteries there, and then if you have an active system that can send us signals, when you're having extreme load periods, we can be discharging during those load periods. And that takes the strain off assets like your distribution lines, your transformers. So we need to go beyond just a flexible interconnection approach. We need to go to a grid positive approach. But that requires a big tent, and that requires us to work hand in hand with utilities. And so we need to really move away from an oppositional stance into a cooperative relational stance with our utilities. They own the poles and wires, and we have the resources and the products and the technology that can alleviate the stresses that they're experiencing from things like electrification, extreme weather events. But that requires relationship building. So, get out there and shake a utility hand today. That's my pitch. Sorry, shameless. Okay.
And I hope the Massachusetts sports fans won't mind me saying, but I think New York has a quite a nice interconnection landscape. No, by no means solving all our problems, but ahead of the pack, I would say. They have a very good tariff, and they have working groups that really try to push the envelope. So props to them. Yeah.
Actually, I was just talking with somebody from SEPA today, and it would matter for SEIA as well. Probably, I think, as I mentioned, I'm a former regulator. I served on the Maryland Public Service Commission for 3 years, and then I led the policy team at Sunrun. And at that time, we really, so this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, we reached out to EEI, the Edison Electric Institute, and because I was going to these NARUC, the Association of Regulatory Commissioner meetings, 3 times a year, and you'd see the same people. You'd see the utility counterparts, and we would be there. And we decided we were going to take on interconnection, believe it or not. And we did. We met probably 3 of the times before those meetings and tried to come up with principles. They were never adopted. But I think that now, here we are. It is a different time. I think there's a greater recognition of the value of these resources on the utility grid. And I do think it's time again, to try to figure out how we can pull together, work with utilities, work with the third-party providers who are so critical, the technology developers like a Generac, and the trade associations to really think about it. Because even back then, which seems like a long time ago now, what struck me is we had some utilities that were quite advanced in interconnection. I mean, at least it was automated. Then you would have other utilities who literally still required paper documents to be mailed in. We just can't operate that way, right? And so it was even the simple idea of can we just get the best practices of the best 5 utilities in the country and share them? And then can we, as on the side of the solutions providers, get some common understanding of what is really needed? And I think IREC plays a really important role there, and try to limit the delays, the expense. It just seems so feasible to me. And so I would suggest somebody, maybe our trade associations, try to convene people to take another shot at that, because I think there's a lot of potential.
The CCSA is working quite hard in Maryland on the interconnection side. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, and we're actually engaged in that interconnection docket in Maryland as well, and it's been fun to see how when people are collaborating behind the scenes and you can get stakeholder engagement on both sides, how there are those common solutions. We don't have to be in oppositional relationships. And that's one reason I like litigation. I like the kind of PUC context, but the working groups are often where the work gets done.
Can you talk a little bit about value stacking and that as another challenge facing energy storage?
Yeah. So I would not characterize it as a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a real opportunity, value stacking. And by value stacking, we mean that a single asset can be put to different uses at different times, or multiple uses at sometimes to recognize the revenues, right? I think the challenge is a little bit in what Anne said earlier, that not all of the elements of the value stack can be monetarily compensated these days. And there are some regulatory and market barriers hindering that. But the actual concept of value stacking is great. So an energy storage asset can be participating in the wholesale markets in energy arbitrage, which means charge at night when the cost of charging is low, and discharge during the day when the cost of energy is high, but then also be available for resilience. So when a storm is coming, they stop the trading on the energy and charge up to be available for power, right? And similarly, the capacity market has a similar utility where you can there might be a big generator that goes down and the grid suddenly needs tens of megawatts, and you're called upon as a capacity resource to provide it, right? So value stacking is in its purest form is the ability to stack the value of the different applications of energy storage. And it's a real opportunity for energy storage to be doing multiple things. And it may not all be at once, like at some point it's doing resilience and other points it's trading in energy. But there are some barriers around, can you participate both at once or for the asset deferral. So if energy storage can provide some volt-var support, can the utilities compensate you today? There's no real mechanism for them to do that, right? And so it's not, that aspect of the value stack is underutilized because there isn't an ability to generate revenue from it. And the cost of batteries is not yet low enough that it can give it away for free, right? So I think value stacking in general is what makes batteries even viable today, but it's not fully there yet, and so we should continue to eliminate the regulatory and market barriers that hinder it.
I think that it's going to be a really interesting time to watch New York, which was one of you mentioned as a key state. So value stacking really became the term about 10 years ago, where they had the REV proceeding, which was recognizing energy value,
Yes, something like that.
envisioning energy value, but it was a big deal. It was a lot of stakeholder meetings, and it really was, a lot of people coming together, trying to think about, I think the former chair of that commission referred to it as animating the market. How can you actually make the economics and make a market? And it had to do with really trying to identify what are the different values. If someone were to put in solar, if they were to put in a battery, now maybe if they're going to put in an EV charger, and how does that relate to either the market at the wholesale level, or even what utilities are already paying for other services, and not really to market, but we know what they're paying as regulators. So that was a lot of work. They put in value stacking at the commercial level, but they did not go so far with the residential level because I think it was just too untested for residential customers. But they've just opened up a new grid modernization proceeding that sounds really exciting, and they also have a very large storage incentive that sounds very exciting. So I'm hopeful that 10 years later now, maybe we can go back and we can actually really dig in and ask those hard questions. How do you value resiliency? How do you value reliability? How can we rely on that instead of maybe having to do billions of dollars of underground lines, right? I mean, there are opportunity costs here that are so high that if we could figure out how to get those economically reflected in the values that batteries and EV chargers and the like can provide, I think we save customers money and we help grow this, really important industry.
And if I could just tag on a little bit to that, I mean, I think when we all started talking about value stacking, and I agree that it was in that 2014, 15, 16 timeframe, we saw the State of Charge report come out in Massachusetts. It was kind of a conceptual framework. It was like someone did an avoided cost analysis. You've got energy arbitrage, capacity, avoided RNS, T&D upgrades, and you just put it all together in a big fat stack and said, hallelujah, storage can do all this stuff. And then we got into the nitty gritty, and it's like, how do you have a small asset? It might be residential or it might be front of the meter distributed, and you aggregate that up so it can participate in the wholesale market to unlock some of those wholesale revenue streams, ancillary services, forward capacity, but then also reflect the local, avoided distribution upgrade potential. So you have an asset that's very flexible and can operate in all these spaces, and then you suddenly get into this tricky area, which is where's that line between state regulation and federal regulation? So we saw two really exciting developments at the federal level. FERC 841, which was an order that said, hey, regional transmission organizations, ISOs, you must create models for batteries to participate in the wholesale markets. And the devil's in the details, because I remember ISO New England a long time ago, you would be offering an asset in as a regulation asset for ancillary services. And it was a battery, they wouldn't accept it. And we couldn't understand why for a long time until meeting with them. It turns out that they were just accepting the way they would create their ancillary services stack for assets they accept was they would take the closest, the least number of assets they had to deploy. And it's a thin market, it's like 40 megawatts. And so all the batteries were getting left behind, and we needed to really amend the language in those tariffs. So sometimes you have to get really deep in the regulatory weeds to unlock the full value stack. And the second order we had that is going to be really revolutionary, but it's taking some time to implement, is FERC Order 2222. And what that does is really say assets that are at the residential level, very deep into the distribution grid, can be aggregated up by many of the companies who have booths at this show, and then bid into the wholesale markets as an actual asset. And that helps with price formation, so it can put downward price pressure for power generation and things like energy arbitrage, forward capacity, and we can hopefully unlock those distribution values. But it really takes engagement at the PUCs, because the utility companies might be able not have the technology that they need in place to unlock the capacity of local systems to do volt-var or volt-watt, for example, to avoid distribution system upgrades. So it takes, I guess what I'm trying to say by that is that the fact that we have batteries that can operate and do value stacking at both the federal level and provide local value has meant that we've needed an unprecedented level of collaboration, cooperation, communication across those jurisdictional barriers that we had in the past. So RTOs really need to go work in what's the word I'm looking for? Work simpatico with their PUCs to make sure that value stacking is possible. Because the dream of we can do all this stuff for the grid can really only be unlocked if the value is recognized by both kind of the RTO and by the local distribution utilities and by the PUCs. So it takes a lot of players to really get on board to make energy storage economically viable. And our hope is over time, as costs come down, that profit margin will get a little bit fatter. We may not need to participate in every single one of those markets every time. But in terms of climate, if you're going to make a massive investment, we're massively transforming the electric grid. If you're going to make that investment, let's get the most bang for our buck. That means we're having these assets perform all of the things that they can do for the grid at all times of day. Integrate renewables, avoid distribution upgrades, smooth out loads, with EVs. And that's going to take some forethought, some planning, and lots of meetings, as we three all have suffered through many.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been an enlightening conversation. I want to give you all an opportunity for any closing thoughts or words.
One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, sometimes when I deal with regulators, they will say these distributed resources are private resources. They're just going to benefit the individual or the school or what have you. And the truth is they're not, and I think that's a really important message that we have to get out there. And they're not private in a number of ways. First of all, if you do happen to have a neighbor who has a battery and you have an outage, you're probably going to be friends with that neighbor. I mean, there are so many examples where we now have neighbors helping neighbors in a shared economy and a shared community. And I don't think we should forget that. Like when we have customers who are investing in distributed resources to protect their families, they're a resource for their community. And it's certainly the case for schools. It's certainly the case for community centers. And then obviously, as we said, not only that, we now have the technology that they can share it outside, physically, share that power. And when power leaves, the physics of power is it really goes to the neighbor. That's the really cool thing about it. So if you see somebody in your neighborhood who has solar panels on their roof and who has a battery or they don't have a battery, thank them, because they're providing power to you next door, nice, clean power. So it is such an exciting time for batteries, and whether they're commercial, resi, in front of the meter, behind the meter, and I just very appreciate the opportunity to speak about it. Thanks.
So I'll say there's a lot of fear out there regarding batteries. Permitting batteries is brutal in neighborhoods, but to Anne's point, it is actually helping resiliency in times of outage, etc. So I would say raising awareness, educating oneself, and at all times the NFPA 855, the National Fire Protection Association Code, which lays out the safety of batteries as applicable both front of the meter and behind the meter. Those are important for local communities to adopt.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I just want to say a big thank you to these two panelists from whom I have learned so much over the course of the last year that I've been working at SEIA. It's really an honor to serve alongside you in all of these public proceedings. Yeah, it's just a pleasure and an honor. And also to be working for SEIA, which is doing so much work on behalf of the industry every single day. So I'll kind of repeat my call from earlier, which is if you're not a member of SEIA, please join. It's it's critical time for the industry, and if we see the repeal of critical provisions of the IRA, we could be facing really difficult times over the next 18 months or 2 years. So please join SEIA, get involved with our political efforts, stay involved at the state level, at the local county level, and reach out to us. We're always a resource. We're your trade association for a reason to help you navigate the complexity of today's energy market. And then I'll just close with the thought that if you are a strictly solar company and you haven't gotten into batteries, I would definitely advise you at this trade show, get out there on the floor, familiarize yourself with the technology, familiarize yourself with the vendors, because we're seeing systems be paired more and more. So by 2028, we expect roughly 25% of residential systems, your customers are going to be asking for energy storage. So it's a technology that you need to really get familiar with. And again, just to reiterate the safety piece, always install everything according to manufacturer instructions and get your entire staff trained on NFPA 855 so that we can make sure we're protecting our customers and representing the industry as best we can.